So today's program is Uncovering and Interpreting Indiana's Queer Past. And today's presenter is Nicole. She is an Indianapolis-based public historian, specializes in social justice and minority history, as well as history relevance. I happen to actually know Nicole. She and I went to grad school together. So I'm very excited that she is our presenter today. I also know that she just got back from the 2022 Queer History Conference in San Francisco. So this is an amazing topic for her to be presenting on, and she is very knowledgeable on this topic. So thank you everybody for joining us. And Nicole, do you want to go ahead and say hi to the folks and then share your screen?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Let's see, I can just maybe talk a little bit first before I do that about my background and kind of how I got into studying LGBTQ history. I work for the Indiana Historical Bureau, which is a division of the Indiana State Library. And my main work there is doing research for state historical markers, and we have about 700 or so now. And we just installed our first LGBTQ history marker, which is really exciting, considering that we're a state agency in a pretty conservative state. So that is now on Monument Circle. So I got to do the research for that, and it's really exciting. I also manage our Indiana history blog, which has about like 8 or so well-researched queer history topics. And I help facilitate the Hoosier Women at Work History Conference, write digital encyclopedia of Indianapolis articles, kind of wear different hats in my position. But I got into queer history because I looked around at all of our various projects and wanted to do something that we had never done before. And again, I don't know if it's because we are a state agency that we were always like a little bit wary to delve into this history. But I started looking around at Michiana Memory, which has a really great LGBTQ digital collection. And I discovered Gloria Frankel, who was a lesbian activist, and she opened the Seahorse Bar in South Bend in the 70s. And it hosted drag shows. It provided a testing site during the AIDS epidemic, and it was really just like a anchor in the community. It even was firebombed in the 80s, and the community helped rebuild it. So I wrote that history up, published it, and then when we published or shared it on social media, the response was amazing, and people were just so excited to see just any little bit of their history, and they in the comments were sharing their experiences there, and it was really great and encouraging. So then after that, I got onto the Indiana Landmarks LGBTQ committee, presented on a panel for Roche's Pride Week, and as Allison mentioned, I just got back from the 2022 Queer History Conference in San Francisco, which was really amazing. So I thought today maybe I would kind of give a rundown of Indiana LGBTQ history as I know it. It's a pretty emerging field, and as most people know, a lot of sources, just a lot of experiences weren't documented because of privacy issues and stigma and that kind of thing. So at least for me, I've tried to piece together what I can find from digitized newsletters like the Works. Okay, the earliest history covered in the Works, the gay newsletter published out of Indianapolis, mentioned that at the dawn of the 20th century, until World War II, there were drag performances along Indiana Avenue, or rather Virginia Avenue, which is now Fountain Square, pretty like artsy neighborhood. And in the 20s and 30s, in Indianapolis, church groups hosted a play called A Womanless Wedding, which I'd like to know more about that. They didn't really elaborate. And then in Indiana Avenue, which is a historically Black neighborhood that was full of music venues and restaurants, it was really thriving. They had a lot of really popular drag shows beginning in about the 30s, and then going until about the early 70s, when the Black community there was displaced by the creation of the highway and then IUPUI. And then, as we know, in the 1940s and 50s, there were a lot of raids, police entrapment during the Lavender Scare. And one victim of this was Charles Allen. Charles Allen at the piano, and he was arrested in the 40s for having a relationship with a serviceman. So a judge sentenced him to, I think, 4 years in prison, where he actually kind of thrived. He had lots of lovers there. He honed his dance skills. And then when he got out of prison, he actually opened his own studio in Fort Wayne, and then went on apparently to work with the greats like Billie Holiday and help them choreograph their routines. And if you're interested in him, I did write a post about him for our Indiana history blog. He's really fascinating. And then on to the 1960s, the Metropolitan Community Church opened in Indianapolis, and it's long been an ally to the queer community, and it was really important because it provided a safe space for them to meet. And then in 1974, the Indiana Gay Awareness Conference in Bloomington was held, and this was the first statewide conference of its kind. And 2 years later, the Community Church and Gay People's Union hosted the first Pride Week in Indiana. And at this point, people celebrated privately. They would go to picnics or meet in a hotel and socialize, but it wasn't like in New York, you know, when there was the post-Stonewall Pride Weeks. And these celebrations were pretty private, I would say, until the early 90s. 1977 was a year that really moved the needle forward for the queer community in Indiana. Anita Bryant, who most of you probably know, was an evangelical pop singer, and she managed to overturn an ordinance in Miami that would have protected LGBTQ citizens from losing their job for being gay. So in October of that year, she came to Indiana and she performed at the, quote, Rally for Decency at the state fairgrounds in Indianapolis. And she was met with hundreds of protesters and allies, and many of the allies had never really even thought about the plight of the queer community. And so her kind of vitriol got them to kind of pay attention and come out and be an ally. This also happened when she visited South Bend and performed at Notre Dame later in the month. She was met with protesters who tried to kind of show kindness by bringing her flowers and tried to hold a reception in her honor so that she could kind of see that they weren't these monsters that she had portrayed them to be. So going out of their way to protest politely, as opposed to in other places where people threw a pie in her face. And then at the end of that month, she also performed at Fort Wayne's Embassy Theater for an anniversary celebration of the Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. So people came and picketed with signs that said, "Gay is okay." So that her visits here really pushed some people to come out of the closet because they wanted to prove her wrong. And it also kind of generated more public discourse about homosexuality. And then onto the 1980s, we have the formation of organizations and coalitions. In 1980, Justice Inc. was founded by lesbian activist Kathy Saris, and she is really responsible for organizing Pride events. Justice Inc. also hosted voter registration drives and advocated for gay rights legislation. And in that same year, Fort Wayne's GLOW, or Gay Lesbian Organization, was founded. And the year after that, Stanberg, who he owned a bathhouse in Indianapolis, he founded The Works, which is a treasure trove of information. There's a lot of editorials in there from people belonging to the queer community about various topics. And they publicized events that were going on, not only in Indianapolis, but in the state and then kind of in the region. So we are very lucky to have that digitized. In 1982, the Greater Indianapolis Gay Business Association was founded. And then 1984 was a watershed year for LGBTQ individuals. There had been a lot of police harassment and surveillance leading up to that, and a lot of apathy when it came to the murders of gay men in Indianapolis and in the area. And so organizers like Kathy Saris and Stanberg planned these, what they call gay nights on the circle. And so people came out every weekend in the summer of 1984, and not to protest. They made sure to clarify that this was not a demonstration or protest, but rather a gathering of people who could help kind of raise visibility for the queer community. And this empowered a lot of the people who ended up going. And then 1989, the Indiana Crossdresser Society, or IXE, was founded, and people from all walks of life joined it. People who were police officers, engineers, carpenters. There were about 100 members who met every month. And at that time, I would say people identified as heterosexual men who like to wear quote unquote women's clothes, but today may have identified as trans women. But this society was really important because in 1989, gay bars started kicking out gender nonconforming individuals for various reasons. Some said that they wanted to maintain their masculine atmosphere, and other bar owners worried that they were breaking excise law by admitting people who outwardly looked like women, but whose ID might look like a traditional male. And so in the pages of the works, you can kind of follow this conflict. And a lot of people wrote in condemning this discrimination. Other people agreed that they should keep certain places just masculine. But through a series of kind of town hall meetings, which were actually facilitated by Shirley Providus, who you see on the screen there, who was a police officer and liaison, a series of discussions, bar owners eventually kind of reversed policies, showing how important it is to have these forums for discussion to kind of understand where each segment of the community is coming from. And I also wrote a blog post about that if you guys are interested in learning more. And then on to the 1990s. In 1990, Indiana's first large public outdoor pride celebration was held, and this is what the marker commemorates on Monument Circle. So hundreds turned out to see drag shows and hear from AIDS activists, and people wrote to the works talking about how like it emboldened them to live more openly and increase solidarity. So it was a big, exciting moment. And then, as we know, in 2015, RFRA was enacted by Mike Pence. 2018, Roncalli guidance counselor Shelley Fitzgerald was fired after it was discovered that she was married to a woman. So this history continues to be made, and I by no means am an expert or a definitive expert on this history. I'm looking forward to hopefully maybe hearing from you guys and adding to this history. But I thought I would talk about some of the overlapping themes that I discovered while working on this history. It seems that Indiana is uniquely nonviolent and espoused polite protest, as we saw with the 1984 gatherings, where they made sure to note that this was not a demonstration, it was just socializing. As we saw with the reception of Anita Bryant, people going out of their way to be kind and polite. I also think it's interesting reading expectations of queer people and expectations that they put on themselves. Living in a conservative state, people would write into the work saying, like, you know, criticizing people who didn't live outwardly, and said that this kind of like stopped any momentum. But people wrestled with how to come out in a conservative state. Should they come out in a conservative state? So having expectations, I think 21st century expectations and even expectations back then is interesting, and sometimes people just, I guess, did not have the same for themselves. There was not a big pivotal moment in Indiana, at least, nothing like Stonewall, but there was a slow kind of chipping away at stigma and discrimination through various events, and discrimination did spur allyship and kind of humanize the struggles of queer individuals in a way that hadn't been before. And I think the importance of forums and allyship is really seen, especially in the 1989 conflict, where there was discrimination in bars. Making space for discussions was really important. And I guess that probably would be the same for any state. So I thought maybe now that we have a little primer, I would go through some of the resources that I have found to be really helpful, at least for doing Hoosier history. There are a couple of theses that have been digitized. You can find them on ScholarWorks. And Allison, I can provide a list if that's helpful to people after this, so that they can access these sources. I thought I'd pull up real quick our Indiana history blog so you guys can see. If you just go to the search bar and you search queer, gay, homosexual, LGBTQ, lots of different posts will pop up, as you can see here. Okay. Lillian Faderman's new The Gay Revolution is a really nice primer. And then I haven't read it yet, but Anne Belay's Steel Closets, Voices of Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Steelworkers seems really interesting, because history in Gary and the region has been kind of looked over in general. And so to have somebody really focus on queer individuals living there is interesting. And then the National Park Service had undertaken a study of LGBTQ history and how to kind of commemorate it. And they have made that freely accessible here. So you can see lots of chapters, and I think they might still be adding to it. But that could be a nice primer for research. So that was secondary. Here are some just databases and collections that are related to American history, not necessarily specific to Indiana history, but most of them are freely accessible, and I highly recommend the University of Washington's LGBTQ primary sources, which is where I pulled this FBI document when they investigated the Mattachine Society. They have lots and lots of different digitized sources here. And again, not specific to Indiana or the Midwest, but if you just type in Indiana, or if you have a specific name, you never know what might pop up in any of these publications. So the Chris Gonzalez GLBT archives are fantastic. That's where you can access the works, which, as I mentioned, it reports on events not just in Indiana, but in the Midwest and sometimes in the nation. So most of the collection is the works, which you can see down here. But they also have a fun little, kind of a fun little program called The Screamer, which is full of like poetry and doodles, and maybe not so much helpful to research, but is a fun little thing to peruse. And I mean, the graphics are just super fun on all of these. I have spent many hours looking at the works and could spend many, many more hours. Okay, back to my sources here. The Indiana State Library has digitized some sources. They're mostly related to Pride celebrations, a lot of programs and ephemera. Not the most extensive collection, but helpful because you can, see the names of who was speaking and attending, kind of peruse those a little bit. But more excitingly, we at the library just were given the Northeast Indiana Diversity Library, which includes, some of it has been digitized, although we have shelves and shelves and shelves of gay newsletters, correspondence, things like that that have yet to be even processed. So I'm going to start helping with that soon. But you see that we have the Fort Wayne publication Twa, and that's where I found some information about Charles Allen and different topics. So I would definitely check these out and then check back for more material from that collection, as I think they're planning on digitizing it. Kinsey Institute and Special Collections, most of that you actually have to be on campus to look at, but still very helpful. And then here is our Michiana Memory LGBTQ collection, where I gathered information about Gloria Frankel, who's right there, the lady being lifted up. And there's a lot of information about the seahorse, and I believe other bars in the Michiana area, as well as information about the Lambda Society, which was one of the early gay rights groups. Yeah, there you go. You can see right there. All right. Try to run through these real quickly. The Michael Bohr collection at the Indiana Historical Society is great. It has more queer newsletters. I believe there's even like video footage in there. Oh yeah, 13 manuscript boxes, videotapes, periodicals. You can definitely do a deep dive there. Let's see, the Indiana LGBTQ collection at the Historical Society. This history, I think, mostly includes the 80s, 90s, 2000s, so newer history, but there's really great photos. And then here you can also find like oral history interviews, which IHS has done a really great job of conducting with members of the community. And then the Mary Byrne collection, as in many fields, women have not been given the credit that they should be. And I would say in Indiana queer history, it's very male centric. So the Mary Byrne collection would be really interesting to go through, as she was an activist and I believe a business owner at that time. And then here's some miscellaneous resources that I have found really helpful. The Making Gay History podcast is wonderful. It's done by a journalist who has interviewed some of the more well-known activists like Sylvia Rivera, and then some of the lesser known activists. And I know he did interview some Hoosier individuals. And then we also have the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Recovering Queer History in Indianapolis map. And it allows you to kind of click on the various circles and it'll pull up a bar or an organization. It'll tell you if it's eligible for like a National Register nomination. It'll tell you kind of what the bar's or venue significance was. Unfortunately, it's just limited to Indianapolis, but I think they're going to be adding more to it. And then lastly, what I found to be really helpful is social media and groups like the Central Indiana LGBTQ History Facebook group, because these are people who live that history. And I know people will post photos and say like, do you know who this is? And people can help identify them, kind of crowdsource that history a little bit, and then maybe add comments about their experience with that individual or that place. But social media is definitely, I think, a really helpful resource. Things to be mindful of when doing this history definitely involve evolving terminology. Like, for example, Allison and I were just talking about the term queer. It used to be a derogatory term, and now it seems like people in the community have kind of grabbed a hold of that and taken it back. And I don't know if it's because the acronym LGBTQ is getting really long or what it is, but it's important to be mindful of terminology, especially as it changes so quickly. And I know PFLAG has a really great glossary of terms that they update regularly. So I try to check that whenever I'm working on this history. It's also important to be mindful when it comes to terminology that, you know, people may not have identified as trans women, or their just terminology might not have existed in the period that you're studying. So in cases like that, with the Cross-Dresser Society and things like that, I tried to kind of err on the side of caution and say gender non-conforming individuals when I was in doubt about how that person would identify. I also think it's really important to give agency when you can, because so much of this history is dark and people have become victims to AIDS or to violence or discrimination. So I like to, whenever I can, try to learn about a person's family or hobbies, things like that, just to humanize them a little bit. And then intersectionality within the community is important to keep in mind, that the community is not a monolith, that the experience of Black queer individuals are very different than white, or trans individuals very different than, you know, cisgender. So I always try to ask myself, like, who's not represented in this story? It's also important to not assume or ascribe queerness, and to keep in mind that, you know, same-sex intimacy across different eras and cultures can be interpreted as queer when it's really not. Or for example, like fascist Nazi images that glorify the male body can be interpreted as like homoerotic when again that was used for a very different purpose. Also to be mindful of outing people who privately identify as queer. We kind of wrestle with this when, you know, given a collection and there's lots of great pictures of individuals, and I just kind of wonder, like, how did these pictures get into the collection? Would they be comfortable being identified as being queer? And you know, they might have families still living who this would be a shock to if they came across them in a collection guide. So that's something that I still kind of wrestle with. And then lastly, look for the breadcrumbs. For example, if you see in the 1980s a male in their 30s who passed away in the obituary asked for donations to the Damien Center, which is an AIDS organization in Indianapolis, then you might pursue other sources that it might give you an indication that they might be queer, and then you can try to find other corroborating sources. Same kind of with Mary Garrett Haye, who was a really prolific suffragist. And I had heard that she was in a lesbian relationship with Carrie Chapman Catt, who I'm sure a lot of you guys know, also really prolific in the movement. And so I dug into the US Census, and it's interesting that they lived together for several censi, and that they are listed as both a single and friend. So I took that and then looked up where they were both buried, and instead of being buried with their husbands, they were buried next to each other. And then I found some correspondence between the two of them that made it like very clear that they were together romantically. So obviously sources aren't going to say, yes, these are gay people, but if you kind of read between the lines, that'll give you some indication. And then in terms of what is left to be done, so much in this field. I think conducting interviews with people who made and witnessed this history is so important because so much of it just had never been documented. And I think it's important to if you can, track down individuals in like rural areas or areas outside of capital cities, because as we know, queer people lived everywhere, and to get their experiences documented would be really helpful for historians. Finding and digitizing newsletters, correspondence, ephemera, so that people can kind of search it digitally and piece together some of the names that are in those with other sources is very helpful. Public commemoration, at least in Indiana, we, as far as I know, we really only have that historical marker. We don't have any street names in honor of queer individuals or memorials or walking tours. So hopefully this marker is just the first of many. And then lastly, identifying and protecting historic sites. I know Indiana Landmarks conducted a survey, and I believe they're trying to submit National Register nominations in order to protect these sites. So I believe that's it.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and end the program. Make sure to register for our upcoming programs if you have any interest in any of the different topics, and please contact us for genealogy, and contact Nicole if you have any questions about queer research in Indiana or anything that she's been researching. Nicole, you have a pretty wide research breadth, so I want to make sure that people know that they can contact you, and make sure you look at the blog on the Indiana Historical Bureau's website. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Nicole, and have a wonderful day.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.